It's the 7th of January, 2024, and our reading today in 2 Corinthians is in chapter 10. By the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you, I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold when away. I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be bold, as I expect to be towards some people who think we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. You are looking only on the surface of things. If anyone is confident that he belongs to Christ, he should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as he. For even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than pulling you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters. For some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he's unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we're absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the field God has assigned to us, a field that reaches even to you. We are not going too far in our boasting, as would be the case if we had not come to you, for we did get as far as you with the gospel of Christ. Neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of work done by others. Our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our area of activity among you will greatly expand, so that we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. For we do not want to boast about work already done in another man's territory, but let him who boasts boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Amen. Well, we sort of come back now into the mainstream of the argument and the conflict that is going on between Paul and the Corinthians. That's why he says again and again that he has to be bold in talking about his own ministry. More than that, he has to even boast in his ministry. Now, that's not a word maybe we feel very comfortable with. I think in the older versions and more literally, he says that he glories in the ministry that he has had amongst them. And we do need to explain that a little bit because, again, we as Christians, we're all into love, we're all into humility, and we're all into being like Christ. And remember how when he was put on trial, a bit like Paul is being tested here by these people. Do you remember there were times when he said nothing and he was silent and he did not, as it were, defend himself? And there will be times when we have to do that. It's one of the most difficult things in the world. It doesn't come naturally. It doesn't come easily. We need, obviously, not only the example of Christ, but the power of Christ within us to be able to shut our mouths and be dumb at times when we're being accused. So, how could we possibly justify Paul defending himself here? Well, he's not really defending himself. That's the point. He's defending the God given ministry that he has, because in doing that, he is protecting and defending these people. You see, there are obviously those amongst them, the people who are referred to here, who are taking the lead in trying to trash Paul's ministry, tear down everything he's achieved, break up into little pieces the love relationship between Paul and his converts, the church in Corinth. These people are hinted at here. For example, in verse 2, some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. There were some people, and I think these must be the super apostles, the false apostles. We'll get to hear more of them in the following chapters. And part of their goal was to promote their ministry by tearing down Paul's ministry. But the problem with that is that Paul's ministry is the ministry of Christ. When Paul says my gospel, it means Christ's gospel. Whereas these false apostles, they were preaching a gospel, but it was another gospel. So that is why I think Paul has to stand up for himself, but he's not really standing up for himself. We know in other passages in 2 Corinthians, he was prepared to be trampled on, to be imprisoned, to be shipwrecked, to be treated like a dog, if by suffering he brought the gospel to more and more people. He hints at this towards the end of the chapter. So what he's really doing, and he quotes from Jeremiah 9:24 in verse 17, let him who boasts boast in the Lord, or let him who glories glory in the Lord. That's really what he's doing here. He's not boasting in himself. He's not bringing glory to himself. He's really promoting, lifting up, glorifying Christ for the gospel ministry that's been given to Paul, and they need to be faithful to that gospel ministry, and they can only do that by being faithful to Paul, what he preached and the way that he lived, not the false teaching of these super apostles with their false teaching, but also their false kind of prosperity gospel type preaching and lifestyle. So we need to go back over this chapter again and again, I think. It's not easy necessarily to pick our way through it, and there'll be phrases and expressions we struggle with. But that's basically what's going on here. And I just want to leave you with one verse. They were challenging Paul that he was this rather worldly, rather pathetic, rather timid person who couldn't speak properly in public and had all sorts of physical ailments. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a superstar preacher like these men. He didn't have power as they saw it and as they presented it. But in fact, Paul had the most powerful thing in the world. He had the gospel ministry from the risen Lord. And look what he says in verse 4. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. He's not really defending himself. He's defending the gospel and what it can do. Doesn't matter what you look like. Doesn't matter what things appear to be like externally. False religion is always obsessed with clothes and buildings and eloquence and celebrity and the visual, the image. No, the true gospel, its power is divine. It's not a worldly weapon that we fight with. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds, because ultimately, what is the power of the gospel? It is to tear down the lies, the idolatry, the unbelief, the enmity against God that is enthroned in every human heart, in our hatred against God. We are born like this. We live without him. And then when the gospel comes, we reject it. That is the ultimate stronghold of Satan. There's only one power in the universe that can tear that down. And that is the power of the gospel that we preach and that we live. And that's why Paul, he not only explains that here, but he also stands up and says, and yes, I am the apostle, the minister, the ambassador, the presenter of this gospel to the world. That's what I did for you. Don't reject me. Don't reject this gospel. It's the only power in the universe that can save us from sin, death, and hell, get rotten, filthy, stinking sinners like us out of the pit, and one day into the very glory of heaven. That's something to boast about. That's something to be bold about. And that's something to stand up and speak out about, which is exactly what Paul is doing in this chapter.